Welcome, everyone, to another webinar from the Penn Project on the future of U.S.-China relations. My name is Neysun Mahboubi, the director of the project, and I'm coming to you live from my office at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm so delighted to get our webinar series relaunched at the end of a few months of a lot of activity for our project. The last time that you've seen us in this webinar series, we were sharing the papers and the findings and recommendations from our second cohort of project fellows. Shortly, within the next few weeks, we will be publishing the final versions of those papers that we discussed earlier in this webinar series. But in the subsequent months, we have also selected a third cohort of project fellows, an extraordinary group like our earlier groups of project fellows. We have convened that third cohort of project fellows on campus at the University of Pennsylvania. We have taken them to China for a week of extremely productive dialogues with both Chinese and foreign interlocutors, which will be the subject of our discussion today. And in about a month, we will be taking those project fellows to Washington, D.C. to share their draft findings and recommendations with a wide range of policy audiences in Washington. Later this year, in the fall, we will start to share our third cohort project fellows papers and findings and recommendations again in this webinar series. But for the moment, in the interim of the experience of our third cohort fellows, we thought it might be useful to let our wider audiences get a window into what they learned during our week in Beijing. It was a week that included meetings with Chinese academic interlocutors at a workshop at Tsinghua University, but also with governmental interlocutors at a wide range of Chinese government departments. We also met with American officials, with foreign diplomats, with journalists, with representatives from international institutions in Beijing. We tried our best to give our project fellows as many different vantage points into the kinds of questions that they are researching in their policy papers through that experience. And because it was such a rich experience and at such a interesting and maybe fraught time in U.S.-China relations, we thought it would be useful to give this readout on what the experience was like by some of our project fellows. We have 17 project fellows, and we obviously can't have all 17 on this webinar, but we've asked 6 of them to speak with you. Before I bring them up on stage, let me just say a few more words about how this trip fits into the overall design of our project and what we're trying to accomplish. First of all, it's really important for me to emphasize that our project is not a dialogue project. The point of our project is not to seek out dialogue with Chinese counterparts or counterparts anywhere else in the world. The point of our project is for each of our policy papers, each of the papers written by our project fellows, to advance useful, concrete, actionable recommendations for U.S. policymakers on U.S. policy towards China that is rooted in the specialized knowledge and expertise of our fellows. That is the point of our project. That is the guiding principle of everything we're trying to do. Embedded in that is this idea that for those of the fellows who are able and willing to go to China over the summer to conduct field research for the empirical findings of their policy papers, that's useful. And it's not a requirement, but to the extent that project fellows are willing and able to do so, we do have a theory that it is useful to get some on-the-ground experience, on-the-ground discussion, testing out ideas in the formulation of these policy papers. And so that is the mindset out of which you are going to hear perspectives from the fellows who are joining us today. I say this because I'm mindful that there's a lot of discussion about the utility of Americans in particular going to China at the present time. We all know about the different kinds of constraints on academic exchange, whether student exchange or scholar exchange, and we're all well familiar with all the reasons that there are concerns among American students and American colleagues in the academic and professional worlds in going to China. To the extent that we have carved out an ability to take our fellows to Beijing to have these dialogues, the point of it, from our perspective, is not simply to demonstrate dialogue, but to actually learn things that are useful for the Project Fellows policy papers. And so as you, the audience, looks at this webinar and other kinds of products that our project will be producing in the coming months, I hope you will hold us to that standard. Hold the speakers in today's webinar to that standard. Are they relaying things that they learned in China that are useful, that would have been harder to learn if they had not gone to China, that can meaningfully improve the papers that they're writing in the course of that project? That is the test. That is the metric for what we are trying to do. That is what justifies, in our minds, the taking of Project Fellows to China in the course of writing policy papers for U.S. policymaking audiences. With all of that said, let's actually get into the conversation. Let me invite the panelists for today to join me up on stage. I will briefly introduce them, and then we will get going in today's conversation. You can read more about each of the Project Fellows you see represented here today in the link that is being shared on Zoom. And for those who are watching on YouTube, you can go to our project website and click on Current Fellows, read much more about not just the extraordinary group you see on screen here now, but all of our Project Fellows in the third cohort of Project Fellows. Let me just briefly say that we are joined today by Joshua Busby, professor at the Lyndon Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas, Austin. Also by Abby Coplin, also professor at Vassar College. By Yingyi Ma, professor at Maxwell School at Syracuse University. Matt Mingey from the Rhodium Group. Jake Werner from the Quincy Institute. And Maggie Jackson, currently from Washington, D.C., but just till very recently served in the U.S. Department of Commerce. It's so lovely to see all of you on screen, and I'm so much looking forward to hear your insights and takeaways from the period of time we all spent together in China and whatever else you were able to accomplish in China this summer. Let me get us going by first asking Josh to share the key insights and takeaways that he can share with the audience from the week that he spent with us in Beijing at the end of June. Josh, let me turn it over to you.
Thanks, Neysun. Delighted to be with you all. As you heard, I'm Josh Busby from the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. I was part of the energy and environment team that included me, Kyle Chan, and Maggie Jackson. Some core observations from our trip include the following. First, the idea of ecological civilization has taken root as a top-down narrative for the future of the country. Ecological civilization conceives of a harmonious relationship between humans and nature, and it seems to shape a lot of the official discourse about where the country is headed, with success in clean technology part of it. It seems to have shaped how lower-level officials think about the environment, which is now central to the country's future growth trajectory. So China is positioning itself as a clean tech superpower, which is becoming key to its ambition and sense of self going forward. Many of the experts we talked to did not see a tension between China's slower economic growth and sticking to its climate goals. If anything, again, clean tech was seen as a growth driver. China has dual carbon goals to peak carbon emissions before 2030 and to achieve carbon neutrality before 2060. And despite continued investments in coal, which are extensive, many of our interlocutors were pretty confident that these targets will be met. Though I would caution that the latter goal is sufficiently far out that we shouldn't be too credulous. Again, clean tech is a driver for economic growth, but at the same time, China is increasingly concerned about energy security and stable employment, which again helps explain its continued use of coal. But the understanding of how coal is being positioned, it seems to be being conceived of more as a source of flexible backup power to renewable, with renewables ultimately taking center stage. Uh, we also had conversations with our interlocutors about the Paris Agreement on climate change. The Chinese, at this point, appear more committed to the Paris Agreement than the United States and are a bit baffled and disappointed by the U.S. decision to withdraw again and worry about policy uncertainty coming from the United States. Our interlocutors were following developments in the U.S. very closely around revisions to the Inflation Reduction Act and clean tech incentives. Many had questions about what would happen after the IRA and what, if anything, might be kept. And subsequent revisions have actually, as we all know, have come out. On the point about U.S. withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, the lack of U.S. government involvement going forward means the process is losing critical scientific expertise, not to mention the weight of the U.S. to push more ambitious action. This lack of engagement at the government to government level means that the Chinese will be looking to subnational and track two opportunities to continue to engage with U.S. interlocutors on climate, including in areas like adaptation or in specific climate and clean tech industries. A lingering question is whether there's any scope for joint work between the U.S. and China at this stage in the climate and energy space. Even areas like helping developing countries prepare for climate impacts seem like contentious spaces given the level of distrust. We may be limited to information exchanges, which is unfortunate from the Chinese perspective because they think they previously benefited from technical assistance from the US that helped it address many of its previous environmental problems. Um, I'm going to make a couple of final remarks and then open it up and can address things more fully in the Q&A. But uh, uh, as we all know that China dominates the market for production and processing of critical minerals, including but not limited to rare earths. And in the West, there is the perception that China's cost advantage in the production of minerals comes in part from its willingness to accept lower environmental and social safeguards in the production of them. One route to a more competitive international landscape for the production of minerals would be for China to raise its standards in line with international norms. And based on our visit, and there is an inherent opposition in China to improving its so-called ESG standards and environment, social, and governance standards around minerals. The Trump administration doesn't appear all that keen on ESG, but there might be opportunities for track two dialogues to help China improve its environmental and social standards in mining. Ultimately, we can't talk about climate without talking about trade dynamics, and tariffs are making people think decoupling is happening and pushing China more towards self-reliance. China's leverage on rare earths came up throughout our visit as a key point of ongoing negotiations between the Chinese government and the Trump administration. And there was the sense that the absence of any real short-run alternatives to Chinese produced rare earths meant that the Trump administration ultimately had strong incentives to reach a successful resolution of the trade dispute with China. And that seems to have been borne out by subsequent developments. Um, I'm happy to say more, but I want to leave opportunities for my colleagues to weigh in. So I'll stop there, but look forward to the Q&A and continued conversations. Thanks.
That's great, Josh. A lot of detail, very granular, and I think a lot of points that people will want to follow up on in the Q&A. And I do want to underscore for the audience that we have a lot of time in this discussion, and we are definitely interested in hearing from you. So you can even begin to put questions in the chat, or rather in the Q&A function, and I'll keep an eye on that. And a little later, I will dedicate time for taking those questions. Josh, I do want to ask you one follow-up before we move on to the next of our colleagues here. You talked about how the interlocutors that we met with, who I think it's fair to say tended to be kind of very much aligned with ideas of taking the climate crisis seriously and wanting to, reach policy solutions that could mitigate that crisis. You alluded to the fact that they, expressed disappointment in the U.S. withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, questioning about even the U.S. at the moment maybe pulling back from some of the domestic commitments under the Inflation Reduction Act. I do want to push you though a little bit. How seriously should we take that? How seriously should we take the kinds of interlocutors that we are meeting with in China at face value for representing, what China's actual commitments in these regards are, when we know that, China does continue to, contribute coal-powered plants to the world, and both, domestically and also in other parts of Asia. Like, to what extent should we actually take, what we're hearing from, let's say, sympathetic to the climate agenda Chinese interlocutors as indicative of what the Chinese government's overall policy is here?
I mean, I think we have to take it with a bit of a grain of salt based on what we're seeing in the coal space. But I think it's simultaneous extensive deployment of renewables and an increasing self-confidence that environmental protection is both good for the country's growth trajectory and how it sees itself positioning itself in the future. And so the question on some level is one of timing. Will they be able to make that decarbonization push on an accelerated timetable that's in line with climate protection, or is it going to happen a bit later? But it seems like it's going to happen because it's that top-down narrative has been firmly established. On a separate trip, I toured the Goshen battery factory, and the sort of guiding principles of the firm seemed wholly consistent with ecological civilization. So that seems to be rating out and persuading people to repeat that in different domains. And people seem committed to that now. But there's also a sense that this is the line that's made to external audiences, that they're pretty self-confident about their ability to do this. And so when you look at the data and step back, it seems like it's an open question about whether that turn away from coal is going to happen as quickly as some of the folks hope it might. And so I think, it's interesting to hear that from so many different key thought leaders, that this is how they're starting to see themselves. But we'll all, watch not only what they say, but what they do.
And I do think that we will also have to pay attention to the implications of China going all in on AI, because we're all reading about the environmental impact of AI, and it will be interesting to see when those two things come in conflict in the Chinese context, which one is going to win out.
Absolutely.
Well, that's great. Thank you, Josh. Let us move on. I have this smorgasbord of topics to choose from. I think I'm going to go national security. And I'm really, really grateful to Maggie Jackson for reporting in this webinar in this area, given that she's actually writing for our project on climate environment issues like Josh. But Maggie has an incredibly varied career and has spent time in the Navy and was very much active in the parts of our conversations throughout the week that touched on Taiwan and other national security issues. So I'm grateful for her to take the baton here and relay a bit about what we learned, experienced, discussed in that week in Beijing on those kinds of issues.
Great. Thank you so much, Neysun. And you are very generous in your confidence of me and the topics I'm able to cover. And I will withhold my comments for the moment on the energy front. So first, I'm going to dive into Taiwan, which obviously is one of the trickier issues that we discussed over the course of the week. And frankly, I walked away more pessimistic about the state of cross-strait relations. But that being said, for the audience, I want to put into context that we were in Beijing just after the first of the series of speeches by President Lai that he was calling the 10 speeches for national unity. And Beijing views this so-called separatist narrative as extremely provocative. And we heard that. We heard government officials really urge more caution. And to us, they reiterated their standard talking points to us that Taiwan is an issue of historical justice. The US may view it as a geopolitical issue, but for them, it's about historical justice. What's concerning, though, is a rising level of tensions with few options for a relief valve and little room for managing what clearly are often misread signals on both sides. And this is especially concerning given the lack of dialogue between the CCP and the Taiwanese government. And one Chinese academic confirmed the view that more and more people are seeing military intervention as the only option. Another interesting angle of this conversation, though, were several comments on the transactional and deal-making nature of President Trump in this context. I think most of the people who we spoke with deeply believed that the U.S. would support Taiwan, especially if they looked to remarks by Secretary Hegseth or more hawkish members of Congress. But quite a few members we talked to were curious about our view on the likelihood of a grand bargain between President Trump and President Xi and what that could mean for Taiwan or even the South China Sea. I'll end on this topic just by noting that since our first visit, a lot has happened. First, the Taiwan recall vote did not go as expected for the DPP. And second, it's been reported that the Trump administration denied permission for President Lai to transit through the U.S. next month. So we must watch how this may impact China's calculations. And to our audience, I highly recommend that you follow our fellow Elsa Kanya's work, who's the true expert in this area. Shifting gears, I'm also going to make a few points about over-securitization, which actually does touch a lot on my research, as well as I think many of us, and it will come up, I'm sure, in the course of the discussion tonight. This topic came up often in our meetings, not always directly, but it did come up. And from Chinese government officials, in summary, we heard three things. First was criticism of the US for using a blanket exception for national security and how that impacted everything from China's technology access to officials' personnel exchange and so forth. The second was a strong justification for China's national security laws and actions. And a third was a doubling down on self-confidence and self-reliance narratives, especially as China perceives the US to be more and more weak and divided. However, outside the halls of government, we were able to get into more nuanced discussion. And one of our fellows, Xiaoyu, who's looking at this topic exclusively in his research, he observed that Chinese interlocutors shared similar concerns about the origin and negative consequences of over-securitization for China, not only at the international level involving great power competition, but also in nuanced domestic and bureaucratic politics. And as an example, actually building on the energy topic, I was interested to hear from one China academic about his view that as it related to clean energy industrial policy, there needs to be a balanced approach between low cost and national security. And his research was in fact doing that and evaluating some trade-offs. That's something I know a lot of us are asking in the US, and I'm very eager to continue that conversation. So while the overall takeaway was that people in China and in the US agree that over-securitization is a problem, the question remains, how do you constrain it? And given China's tightening national security legislation and increasing risks for foreigners we saw just this week with the exit plans, I think as we think about our policy recommendations, this is not a trend that US policy alone will be able to solve. It will largely depend on decisions in China as well. And I'll just end by noting that I think this last point builds into a larger question that came up a lot throughout the trip as well about essentially us hitting really a rock bottom when it comes to mutual trust in the relationship. And how do we start to build mutual understanding and trust? And maybe we'll all, by the end of this year, have some policy recommendations to move us in that direction. But I think that's hard when you think about if we can't build it on a personal level, how do we build it on a national level? With that, I'll stop and turn it back to you, Neysun. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Maggie. You've done a wonderful job of conveying not just what we encountered during the week, but some of the ideas of our fellows in the National Security Group, in particular Elsa Kania and Xiaoyu Pu, both of whom are traveling right now. So they have put you in the spot of having to convey all of this. I do want to underscore for the audience that we had really frank discussions on all of these issues, including and especially Taiwan. Elsa did a wonderful job of laying out the American perspective on that issue, the long-time American perspective on that issue in very clear, direct, and systematic terms throughout the trip, and noting, I think quite clearly in every setting we were there, the recent Chinese actions that have caused concern. One of my takeaways myself, Maggie, was like you, this concern that the needle has shifted in China on the Taiwan issue in particular, that there's a little bit more discussion among the kinds of people we were meeting, whether in government settings or academic settings, that sort of suggested the need to resolve this issue. I retain that concern a month later. We will later in the discussion maybe talk about the discussions that are happening around the U.S.-China trade talks that could be concluding even while we're having this webinar. But I do wonder, Mag, if I could ask you a follow-up, if, from your vantage point, again, you're not writing in this area, but from your vantage point, given that we share this concern, did you come away with some ideas for what to do about that? Because that is a major problem for the United States.
Yeah, I think I'm glad you mentioned some of the frank dialogue that happened between us. And I think that there clearly needs to be, even as an understanding to a starting point, that signals are being misread. And when that happens, then there's a spark or maybe an escalation that wouldn't have happened if there was a better understanding of what the signals were. And I think clearly that's happening across the strait. I think that's also happening between China and the US. And again, I know we're talking about the fact that dialogue is not everything, but especially in this context, I mean, we're not even talking about dialogue across the strait as a starting point. And I think that is a genuine concern. And so I think even us being on the ground and being able to say directly, this is where we have concerns and this is why, hopefully that was a message that resonated.
Terrific. Thanks, Maggie. Okay, in the buffet, I think I'm going to choose next economic issues. So we're going to go to Matt Mingey, who is part of the trade and economics group for our project this year. And Matt, while we're talking, there could be news or there couldn't be news. So I am mindful that you are speaking on the most dynamic issue, perhaps, in this overall issue set, looking back on what we encountered a month ago.
I think that's right, and I think that Josh had the right byword from the trade and economics cohort that I'm part of, along with Louis Groh and Carrie Shong, and that watchword is uncertainty, and especially the idea that events can move very, very quickly, and that governments on both sides of the Pacific and internationally are trying to catch up and figure out where baselines are. I had the fortune or misfortune of being the presenter presenting live during our academic conference when news of the London Agreement or temporary London Agreement on the Geneva Principles broke. And I think that having to react to that is a microcosm for US and Chinese policymakers having to react and figure out where baselines are. We certainly heard, whether it was from foreign diplomats, whether it was from our academic interlocutors, whether it was from Chinese policymakers, searching for principles that they could use to see how policy was being formulated and where the end states were. Whether that was in terms of the structural shifts that both US policymakers are expecting in China and that China is recognizing are certainly the goal of some of the Trump administration in the United States, as well as tactical and strategic goals. There were many questions and probably a few good answers about the durability of any agreement and what it means for economic statecraft, whether or not it's US tariffs or whether or not it's Chinese export controls that were definitely heavily under discussion both before and after the London news broke. Putting that in even more context, I think one other theme that emerged from many of our conversations, especially with Chinese policymakers and academics again, was the view that despite that uncertainty and amidst that uncertainty, that at least from a macroeconomic policymaking view and from a tech policy view, that China remains better positioned than the United States and that its sources of strength are potentially misdiagnosed or misunderstood, they would argue, by some US analysts. Some of the data that we heard and some of the talking points on, say, pointing towards China's trade surplus over the last few years, and certainly in the last few months, despite uncertainty, were a little bit tendentious. Certainly, there were holes that could be poked in the story that emerged in the recent quarterly GDP print. But at the same time, I think Chinese policymakers and many of the other people that we talked to on the ground in Beijing would acknowledge that consumption is the weak point and remains an issue. Interestingly, what the implications of that weak consumption in China, weak demand in China were, I think we were a little bit ahead of the curve because in only a few weeks, discussion of involution, discussion of overcapacity has really shifted. Even when we were there inside conversations, overcapacity was still a topic that I think it was difficult to get in the weeds on, whereas now I think it is a central focus of policymaking. And so I'll be eager to discuss that going forward. And certainly in the Q&A, I think there's a lot that we can read about how China and US policymakers are trying to wrap their heads around it. Lastly, from a personal perspective, as someone who will be writing for the project on China's outbound financial activity and China's outbound financial engagement beyond just trade, looking at financial flows, I think one of the themes that emerged was business as usual, but not business as usual when it comes to China's foreign investment and foreign lending. The traditional story that you'll hear is that in the last few years, especially since the COVID-19 pandemic, that China's outbound activity has been restrained for domestic reasons due to policy shifts, small is beautiful changes in terms of its development finance, but also economic constraints at home. At the same time, well, in talking with representatives of international organizations, academics that are working on those economic policy issues, it was difficult for us at the same time the AIB conference is going on the other end of town, and having side conversations with some of those attendees, as well as looking at news and trying to talk about the BRICS Forum and how China is approaching a changing global system. I think, well, the expectations for new flows out of China, I think both our US panelists and our foreign compatriots would agree there won't necessarily be a big bang, no new changes in the next few years. That the recent uptick that we've seen in data is certainly something that could be sustained, and that there are bigger changes, even if they're not happening all at once. So certainly time of major change in the US-China economic relationship, foreign diplomats, foreign journalists all trying to come to grips to it, and our group as well. But I think it was invaluable for us to be on the ground, to have some side conversations and really try and tease out some of these problems that will continue to be in focus definitely for the rest of the year, if not for years to come.
Thank you, Matt. That's great, and I appreciate you reminding me of the moment when I think it was in the middle of your presentation or your panel that everyone's phones got the news of the London. I guess it was the what is sometimes called a truce agreement out of the London negotiations, and I think we ended up spending collectively, everyone in the room in the workshop spent some time reading through the news report and trying to parse out what it meant from different perspectives. That was certainly one of the fun moments of our workshop. I do want to ask you also a follow-up. I think there's a lot of commentary that puts forward two ideas that you would have experienced and through your trade and economics lens would have, I think, particularly interesting views about. So one idea is that the Chinese economy is exceptionally weak right now, and that is being reflected in all sorts of numbers and experienced by all sorts of different people across different segments of society. And the other idea is that China has tremendous strength in certain sectors that it's exporting to other countries, and has this powerful leverage in its export licenses over critical minerals. So, how do you reconcile those? Are they easy to reconcile? Are they hard to reconcile? What's your overall way of, sifting through the kinds of information that lead people to any of those types of broader conclusions about the Chinese economy?
I think it's an excellent question, an excellent series of two observations, and I think it's something that goes beyond just the narrow trade and economics lens. So I would love, I think, for the plenary session and Q&A, I think every one of our panelists and certainly even the audience, I think, would have a perspective, because it's not just a question of narrow macro views, it's a question of industrial policy. It's a question of systemic thinking. I think on the idea that the economic weakness in China macroeconomically is present. I think that some of the muddled discourse within China on that reflects genuine disagreements over the source of that economic weakness among Chinese policymakers, even on consumption. If you look going back to, say, at the end of last year, in the December Central Economic Work Conference, you see acknowledgments that consumption is weak, we need to stimulate demand. And now even recently, you see out of the PBOC or in the last week or so, questions of, well, maybe we're measuring it improperly. It should be measured proportionally. Or maybe the issue is services and it's not good consumption, it's fine. And so I think that there is sometimes an underappreciation on, the US analyst side of the complexity of economic policymaking, the idea that Chinese policymakers they are attempting to portray sort of a united front and stay on message to navigate those issues and analyze them in real time. I think that to the second part of your question, how does that stack up with China's leadership? I think real leadership in certain technological areas. I think that is something that is an attempt to square that circle, and it is an attempt to hope that innovation, technological leadership in some of those areas, and being able to manage the side effect of that, which is overcapacity in some of those technological areas, whether it's EVs or anything else, will, if not return to the glory days, at least allow a way out so that maybe we don't necessarily have to diagnose all of those issues. If we can innovate quick enough, if we can certainly maintain R&D leads, if we can be faster than the United States or the EU, well, structural shifts will happen. They will happen more naturally, and then it's just a question of trying to manage some of the transition. So I think, well, the idea that China doesn't present a growth challenge in the same way that it did is something that both the US and Chinese policymakers are trying to deal with and will be attempting to deal with for a while. How to respond then is also something where there's still, going back to where I started, uncertainty.
Great. Thanks, Matt. If I was unpredictable, I would veer in a completely different direction, but I am actually quite predictable. And you've lined up a set of framework ideas that I think very naturally lend itself to Abby going next. Writing about biotechnology for our project. So Abby, let's hear your key findings and takeaways from the week in Beijing. And you were there a little longer too, doing some of your own field work as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks so much for having us all here tonight, Neysun. So I would say in general, I have two primary takeaways. First was actually, I was really struck by the fact that science and technology issues were not organically coming up as being really central to many of our government meetings. They were fleetingly coming up, as Maggie alluded, in issues of national security, et cetera. But they weren't the primary thing that most officials wanted to talk about. While this is likely a function of the particular bodies we were meeting with, I think it's also telling. It's hard to imagine meeting with any body in the US government right now about the US-China relationship and not having issues of science and technology be front and center. I think it does imply that this is not the #1 priority for the Chinese side in the US-China relationship. And I think that that's really driven by my second and really primary takeaway, which was in comparison to, say, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, I was really struck during this trip by researchers and entrepreneurs' kind of quiet confidence in the Chinese scientific research and technological development trajectory right now, both generally and in direct comparison with the state of things in the US. On the basic science side, the predominant narrative was really that research funding just keeps getting more ample and more stable, which has been a key issue. That the human capital that China's been able to attract for the past 10 to 15 years has really catalyzed research capability and innovation. And that there is much more explicit and logistical support for academic entrepreneurship for those who want to engage in that kind of behavior. And so I would say particularly when viewing their position in comparison to what's going on in the US with cuts to the NSF, cuts to the NIH, the politicization of research, most of the individuals I was talking to, which I'll add are people I have long-standing relationships with and are really quite blunt most of the time, were pretty optimistic about their decision to return and pretty optimistic about where Chinese research is going forward generally. There was an attitude that in many fields of the biological sciences, we are, if not the global leader, we are certainly a global leader, and that therefore, while we are happy to engage with the world and engage in collaboration, we are also not dependent on doing so. Dynamics on the commercial side were relatively similar. While domestic competition in many high-tech sectors is absolutely brutal right now, much more than I think many on the American side really grasp. There is also a confidence that they have that many of these firms are producing a globally competitive product. And I think that that is also reflected to some extent in consumer choices. Just to end on a quick anecdote, I ended up going car shopping with some of my very dear long-term friends who are long-term BMW consumers, but they weren't interested for this car. They were looking at Neo, they were looking at Ido, and this is not a couple who are constrained financially. They were really making that choice based on performance. They were making it based on the desire for a self-driving system. These really kind of quality innovation kind of concerns. I do think that there's some complications still brewing in the Chinese research system about whether they're going to be able to retain the capital that they have attracted so far, but I'll leave that for discussion.
Great. Thanks, Abby. So the thing that I want to sort of follow up with you about, maybe more from the university side, which I'm a little bit more familiar with, because I'm also hearing and heard during that time and sense sort of this confidence from Chinese interlocutors about, the state of Chinese higher education. And, it comes up both in this particular context of science and technology, but also more broadly when, there's these possibilities that Chinese students may be restricted in being able to come to the study to the US. That you'll hear these words of confidence that, oh, well, our education system is so strong that they can stay here. And I know that I'm sort of starting to intrude a little bit on some points that Yingyi may be making a little bit later on. But at least for you, Abby, the very precise kind of pushback point that's in my mind is we know that Chinese higher education is going through a really tough economic time right now as well. There are massive cuts at the major universities. And so I'm a little suspicious of that confidence because I know that those cuts are working themselves through the very top universities. And so clearly they must be happening at the lower level universities. And so, this idea that everything is great in Chinese higher education and, we're just going gangbusters ahead, frankly, I don't buy it.
Yeah, so I would say that there's my response would probably be twofold. One is that there's a difference between what's going on kind of the educational side of things versus the technological development side of things. And so I think that the Chinese government, and I think this is related to more what Matt was saying as well, really has this imaginary that they are going to be able to innovate themselves out of a variety of economic issues and a variety of issues of social inequality. Again, I think that that's an imaginary and it will not necessarily be implemented as such, but I think that tech firms and scientists in the natural sciences and engineering are definitely, in terms of their research, really grabbing onto this opportunity. And even if, there are some funding cuts from the government, they're finding private venture capital, they are finding other sources to kind of get what they want to do done. The second part of my response, however, is kind of related to the fact that, yes, I think that there's absolutely kind of other things going on under the hood that are worth probing more. So while I'm hearing this story of, yeah, my funding keeps getting better and better, I feel like I have a lot of opportunity. There were also some anecdotes from some individual researchers talking about how they were being pressured to remove the name of a foreign collaborator from a paper that they were publishing, that they were having a hard time finding a passport or getting a passport to go and participate in international conferences, that they were being pressured to publish in China-based English language journals rather than, the normal science, nature, international high caliber journals. And so I think that there is absolutely some politicalization going on here and some complicated dynamics. But I also think that the trajectory, as someone who's been lingering in this field for a long time at this point, is genuinely positive, and that was not lying as a report. And I think that these most of the people I'm talking with are returnees, and returnees from very high caliber American institutions. And so they know the American system, and they have now been in the Chinese system for some time. And I think that it is genuinely true that when they look at what's going on in the NIH and the NSF right now, their objective analysis is my position here is looking more favorable than what my colleagues back at my American institution are facing right now.
Very interesting. Thanks, Abby. Well, I sort of started to drag Yingyi into the conversation already, and now I'm going to fully bring you in. So, Yingyi, of course, you're writing in our research and education area. What were your key findings and takeaways from not just our trip that week in June, but I think you were there a little longer as well, so you might have even more experience to draw on.
Thank you, Neysun. I think this is a very natural transition to my part. I think my primary takeaway is before I made this trip to China, I feel like, and I also observed that there are much fewer Chinese students coming to the United States to study in American higher education. And this trip has confirmed this trend that we're going to have even fewer Chinese students coming to the United States in the next few years, because we're looking at the pipeline. So in China, if you know Chinese education system, the most important examination is called Gaokao, which is the college entrance examination. So 10 years ago, when I conducted my research in Chinese international education sector, they experienced a booming sector called international track, which is set aside from Gaokao, which means the rising middle class parents sent their kids to be on the international education track to avoid attending Gaokao, which is a rat race, extremely competitive, relentless. But now that sector is struggling and shrinking. One of the conversations with the Chinese interlocutors really shows that the leading, the most international education schools, tracks are concentrated in Beijing. And the leading international sectors in some of the China's, Beijing's top high schools have received the lowest record number of students, which really means that in the next 3 years, when the time to apply for American higher education, America will receive the lowest number of applicants, because once you're out of the Gaokao system, you cannot really enter. So that really means increasing number of Chinese students choose to stay within their own system. Doesn't really mean that, I want to circle back to Neysun's point just now. Doesn't really mean that they're happily stay in. I think the sentiment is quite mixed. I think they don't really like the rat race. They don't really like Gaokao, but just that they weigh the benefits and risks. 10 years ago, they think the benefits outweighs the risk. Now the risk outweighs the benefits. So here the risk really refer to geopolitical tensions. They're worried about definitely the US-China relations. They're worried about how Chinese students, especially in certain areas, in STEM areas, in technology areas, are not able to get their visa. And US immigration policy certainly is not helpful. So that's actually the kind of policy paper that I'm focusing on right now, is that the US immigration policy is actually closely linked with the education as well. So like a decade or 2 decades ago, a lot of Chinese students want to study in the United States because they also want to stay in the United States to work. And they increasingly feel that prospect is not as bright as before. So that also drive them to stay within their own system. So that's my primary takeaway, and I think it's actually related to what Abby talks about. It's all interrelated. That the rise of Chinese higher education is indisputable, no matter what you believe in the QS ranking or not. Chinese higher education, especially the top universities, including their research productivity, the research funding, the kind of support they provided to their students, it's just improving quite rapidly. So that has created a lot of appeal, not only to top researchers, but also to top students. So, compared to, I'm from, my home institution is Syracuse University, like a decade ago, if a student can go to a top university in China, and they probably still consider Syracuse as attractive, but definitely not anymore. If they're able to make their way to top institutions in China, they want to stay. And not only they want to stay for undergraduate, they also want to stay for graduate education in China. So we're going to see a dwindling number of Chinese students at both undergraduate and graduate level in the next few years. And one last point is, I think, related to what Abby has mentioned, is the higher number of returnees, especially not the recent graduate, but also the established scientists, professors return to Chinese domestic education due to the rising geopolitical tensions, the attack towards American higher education, the fewer research support they provided. So that has created this sort of cycle of, the rising quality of Chinese domestic education. So this is like the ecosystem. Okay, so I'll stop here, and I am looking forward to some of the questions in Q&A.
Great, Yingyi. I do want to ask you also a quick follow-up, and you kind of alluded to this, but I kind of want you to speak more robustly to the questions we received throughout the week about what exactly is U.S. visa policy for Chinese students. We were there kind of a few weeks after the initial announcement that the U.S. was going to aggressively revoke Chinese student visas. And then the walk back that was a few days after that from President Trump, which then he was communicating quite strongly in the subsequent weeks. But it was still, I think, a live issue when we were there. And I think most of the time that you were being asked questions, especially in governmental settings, that was a question that people were interested in. How do you reconcile, what you are also conveying, this notion of, Chinese kind of confidence about higher education with, the extreme interest in whether or not Chinese students would be able to go to the US to study, right? If you think that they're fully confident, then maybe they'd be like, who cares? Like, I don't want to go, right? But I think there were so many questions about that it makes me wonder, that valuation is still there if the possibility is still there.
Right. So how to reconcile that sort of contradiction? So my understanding is for students who are able to make it to the top universities, there's no contradiction. They're going to stay. And the data is pretty straightforward. If you're looking at the study abroad rate of top universities like Tsinghua, where we had our workshop, their percentages of studying abroad is single digit now. Like a decade or 2 decades ago, it's a huge decline. But there is still the desire to study abroad. That really means a lot of Chinese students were not able to make it to the top institutions in China. So you mentioned that I stayed in China over a longer period of time after our trip is over. I tell you what, the most frequent word I've heard related to education is involution. Everybody, from academics to street vendors to parents, of course, to students, everybody was complaining about Chinese education system. So they're not really, yes, they're confident, but they're upset. They're unhappy. They're unhappy with this relentless nature of competition, which is it's called involution, really means competition in a very unhealthy and unproductive way. And I think during our trip to China is at the Gaokao stage. So the Chinese Gaokao is ended. The result is coming out, and people are complaining that this is an unprecedented, difficult season, means that exams are very difficult, but the scores are higher than the previous years. That really means that Chinese students are studying extremely, is harder than before. So this relentless competition has actually made a lot of students still want to exit the system. Okay, so that's why there's still some questions about visa, some concerns about whether I can study abroad, whether I can get the visa. So that's how I sort of reconcile that kind of contradiction.
That's super helpful. Thank you. So we're going to go back up to the macro level now. Jake is writing about, broader governance theories, ideologies, and had, I think, a lot of interesting discussions that at least I watched during the week in Beijing on those types of themes. So, Jake, what are your key takeaways from those discussions over the course of that week in Beijing?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. And thanks again, Neysun, for all the work that you've done on this. So the topic area that I'm part of is the human rights law and democracy. And I'm sort of last and least here because this was the topic, I think, with the least substantive engagement we had on the trip. And of course, we're talking about China and human rights, so maybe that's not so surprising. But I think it's not quite the reason that one might assume. And so I'll just share one episode that I thought was quite revealing. We had a meeting with one Communist Party organization, and the Chinese asked our side if checks and balances still exist in the United States. And now, in the past, I think it would be easy to kind of lodge this in every criticism the United States has at China. China tends to turn it around and sort of do like an ironic performance of the critique of the United States on the same grounds, even though China itself claims to not hold such values. And it'd be very easy to assimilate that incident into that way of thinking. Okay, China's just like pointing out our own hypocrisy in order to get away from the critique. But at the end of that exchange, I think it became clear that it was actually a real question. It was a point of information. They wanted to understand if there were checks and balances still in the United States. And I think this points to a really deep change sort of in the nature of the human rights and democracy issue in the US-China relationship and globally as well. Because this is a change, I think, that reflects what's going on in US politics and the kind of the formal public ideology of US politics and its role in the world. And of course, Trump is throwing out much of the language of human rights and democracy. He's repudiating aside from certain selective instances of such as Brazil today, but in general, sort of repudiating the commitment to human rights and democracy. But this is not just about Trump. I think Trump is sort of accelerating this process, but also there's no question that the way the Biden administration conducted itself tended to discredit the entire idea of a liberal international order. The Biden administration shut down the WTO system. It sort of celebrated electoral authoritarian regimes when they were geopolitically useful. And most of all, of course, it's threw its backing behind the mass killing in Gaza. So I think there's sort of a secular trend in the nature of US foreign policy that reflects a deep change in the way that human rights is working globally. Previously, this would have been sort of a hierarchical relationship. The United States was engaged in a tutelary project, sort of showing China the way to liberalize so that it could join the United States at the end of history. And I think that pretense is gone now. And it was already breaking down, but it's gone now. And China was, I think, maybe counterintuitively, China was a part of that process for a long time. One of the reasons it's gone now is that China, I think, has conclusively repudiated liberalization, both in principle and in practice. But it's not just that China changed, it's that the United States also changed, and also, incidentally, the entire world. There's been a rise of populism, authoritarianism, nativism around the world that has really thrown aside this traditional negative political rights of free speech and electoral participation, free press, the things that used to fall under this category. And they seem to be breaking down everywhere in the world, not just in the US, not just in China. So I think that comes out of a deeper kind of structural change in the nature of the global system that it is worth reflecting on both the American and the Chinese side. Now, did I see much reflection on that on the Chinese side? I'm not seeing much reflection on the US side. Did I see much reflection on the Chinese side? No, I did not. But I think it is one thing that we did find that I think is notable is that our Chinese interlocutors did not have a sense of triumphalism. They did not have a sense that, okay, we were always resisting this idea of universal values for so many years, and you were always attacking us, and now, ha ha ha, look at you. You don't buy it anymore either. There was no sense of that. There was no triumphalism. But there also, I think, there was no lack of an ambition to replace the U.S. ideological leadership that the human rights and democracy issue used to contribute in the way that the U.S. Conducted its power globally. So I think there's, on the one hand, I think we're watching the loss of a lot of things that many of us cherish, and we're losing it not just in the U.S.-China relationship but globally. And I think that there also is an opening here to look in new directions that we can think about how to forge a new human rights agenda. And in interesting ways, my co participants on the human rights law and democracy section are also doing sort of non-traditional human rights focused projects, as am I. I'm working on the idea of global public goods, and what I mean by public goods is not like military security, which is something that is often mentioned when the U.S. talks about global public goods. I'm talking about the concrete everyday needs that everyone in the world has, but that many billions of people do not have access to, such as clean water or sewage or access to electricity. These are sort of basic investments that get to a different idea of human rights, and actually I think one that might be more compatible with official Chinese ideology. So I did not see on this trip or in my discussions with the Chinese side an aspiration to really follow up the rhetoric about social and cultural rights that China often pursues through the UN system or in its official rhetoric as it tries to kind of exert leadership over the global South. We'll talk about the right to development. I'm not seeing follow-up that would actually put that into practice. That's largely a rhetorical pose at this point. But I do think that there are openings worth exploring that would sort of get around some of the previous toxic dynamics of American arrogance around this issue that always led to Chinese defensiveness. And there is, I think, an alternative agenda, way to think about how human rights could be pursued, how we could rebuild the disintegrated foundations of the old human rights agenda through a different set of issues that might make possible U.S.-China cooperation, maybe 4 years from now, if not in the next few years.
Thanks, Jake. I know you're gonna have to go in a moment, but I hope I could just squeeze in a quick follow-up to you before you
Sure.
go. And I also want to just, you a few times people have mentioned particular anecdotes from the trip, which are evocative for me as well. And that moment when we were asked about whether the U.S. still has checks and balances. One of my takeaways from that moment was that the question ultimately was mostly not in the frame of ideological competition, but simply trying to figure out if there is an agreement with President Trump, whether he has enough power to have the U.S. stick to it, or if checks and balances might balance that out. I have to mention, I also remember now that moment in that very same meeting where we were asked about term limits. And one of the other fellows, Carl Minzner, made a quite, I thought, effective statement about the importance of term limits and how term limits are important in any political culture, obviously with a pointed implication for the room we were in at that time. But in any case, the follow-up that I want to have for you, Jake, you, as you said, are writing about provision of global public goods and whether the U.S. and China will contribute to that, whether they can cooperate on that. And as we are in this moment where the U.S. is in some degree of retreat from contributions to that, did you come away from the week in Beijing thinking that China was going to fill that space or make advances in that space or not? Did you reach any tentative conclusions about that from the discussions we had?
Yeah, I definitely concluded, and this reinforced previous conversations I've had with a number of people on the Chinese side, that China has no ambition to fill that role, or even to forge for itself a different role that might cover some of the same ground. I think that is a very common feature of the kind of nightmare fantasies that circulate in DC. The idea that any place that the United States steps back, that's a place that China is going to seize the initiative and marginalize us and reduce our power. China I don't think China defines its role in the world in that way, number one. And number two, I think China is very focused on what it takes to be an extremely threatening posture from the United States across a range of economic and geopolitical issues. And that is really drawing all the attention. So I think that the Chinese now underneath the surface, I think there are changes in motion, and some of the conversations on the trip really helped inform me on this. That there are changes in motion in the way that China poses its leadership globally of the global South. It has long claimed that it's a developing country, and can provide leadership in those terms. So some of that thinking might be changing underneath, and there will be sort of a slow process of transformation coming out of that might make some new possibilities available. But right now, as it has been in the United States for a number of years, the focus is on how do we survive the threat from the other side. And that means we need to focus our resources on things like advanced military technology, on things like controlling the other side's access to technology, on things, a lot of the issues that we're talking about here. How do we make ourselves more competitive? How do we increase our growth? How do we undermine the growth on the other side? It's that place is what's drawing all the attention, and I think that's quite dangerous, sort of in immediate terms, because that's the direction that conflict develops. But also sort of longer term, if we're starving resources to the foundations of the system, what creates consumer demand in our system, and this is true in the United States as well as China, or if we're exacerbating out of control inequalities in both of our countries in order, like in service to this geopolitical agenda, where does that lead us? I think that actually exacerbates the zero-sum conditions that are pushing us towards conflict. So I think that's where China is now, but I do want to flag. I think that there are sort of subterranean changes underway in both countries that might make the relationship and the possibilities on both sides quite different 5 years from now compared to where they are now.
Great. Thanks, Jake. And since I know you may be disappearing at any moment, I just want to thank you for joining this discussion tonight.
Thank you,
So
Neysun.
we have reached a inflection point in the conversation. We've got a lot of the initial ideas on the table. I'm starting to see questions coming into the Q&A. So if anyone is interested to raise a question, please just put them in there. And if you want me to mention who you are, you can sign the question and I will reference that. Just before I start reading them out, I do want to ask everyone who's here to do very quick round robin style, your very quick response to the following question. We can go in the same order of the presentations. And the question is, if you could go back in the near future to conduct follow-up investigations, follow-up research, what would you want to find out about? That's partly a forward-looking question, but also backward-looking in the sense of it's implying that maybe there were things you didn't get to learn on this particular trip that on another occasion you would try to delve into. So we can go in exactly the same order. Let's start with Josh.
Sure. So this issue of disorderly competition or involution in the economic space of intense competition between, say, the Chinese EV firms, that language hadn't really come up in policy conversation until after we left. And so one of the key questions from the US side and wider Western economies is to try to deal with Chinese overcapacity, which potentially poses a mortal threat to the manufacturing sector, not just in automobiles, but in other areas. And are there off-ramps for that overcapacity that could be part of a negotiated settlement? And at the time, it didn't seem like there was much appetite for that conversation in China, that they were pretty optimistic about where things stood. But since we left, that sort of there seems to be more of a self-critique that maybe we need to do something about that. And so I would want to come back to the questions that I posed at the time to see if there's more appetite for something like the Japan-style settlement that happened in the sort of 80s and 90s for foreign direct investment in the U.S. from Japanese firms in exchange for voluntary export restraints. Is there any appetite for that now in China? Obviously, they saw that there were barriers to pursuing that in terms of the willingness by the U.S. and other Western countries to accept Chinese foreign direct investment. Is there any appetite for that? And could that be part of a wider restructuring inside Chinese society that would take some of that competitive pressure and maybe put it in a different context where it's actually employing, say, Americans to work for Chinese companies? There may be limited appetite as yet in the U.S. for that, but President Trump on the campaign trail did say Chinese EV makers were welcome to set up shop in the U.S., whether or not he's serious about that. So I would like to go back and also get into more granular detail of, I heard as I was leaving that some of these companies like NEO were facing real serious economic problems. And so is China actually going to be able to continue to kind of bail out companies, or they're going to have a reckoning so that the 100+ EV makers ultimately comes down to a handful, and what that looks like and what are the implications for their dealings with the rest of the world? So that's what I'm be most interested if I have a chance to go back and see and talk to people.
Great. Maggie, and I will let you not only answer this question with relation to the national security portfolio, which you were kind enough to take on today, but in general, including the topic that you're writing on for this project.
Yes, absolutely. Well, the end of my comments, I already alluded to how much has been changing this week in the Taiwan context. And so I think there would be a lot to follow up on there. I mean, we would obviously be able to see in the coming months what China did in terms of military exercises around Taiwan. Are we going to see that kind of fall off at all? I mean, there would be developments I would recommend following. But I think actually kind of under the over-securitization umbrella, it does get into the questions that I've been asking in my research, and looking at China leaning into self-reliance, and with this acknowledgement, as we've been discussing, that China is dominant in innovation and production and so many clean energy technologies that we rely on. I think there's a question I would like to understand better. We know what we think we need, and I think Josh and I have similar kind of policy recommendations on what we'd like to see in helping to develop the U.S. capability by looking at partnerships between, for example, Chinese companies and U.S. companies. But I think there's a growing question of what China, from the government perspective, will allow. And we saw export controls on batteries. I think, I'm just curious to see if we're pushing for things like licensing or even manufacturing coming to the United States, or other kinds of partnerships. Will that come up against maybe China taking a more protective stance on some of those technologies and leveraging that kind of where they know they have the economic dominance? So I'm interested in kind of pulling the threads on that a little bit more and understanding what that means for the U.S. clean technology sector in the future.
Great. Matt.
For me, it's the fiscal system and government finance. I think it's key to understanding some of the recent news that China, central government policymakers are increasing social spending. It's key to understanding how much support China can provide amidst trade conflict and in resolving overcapacity. But it's also important for understanding how China can support its technological goals. I'd encourage anybody to read a report that's out this week from my Rhodium colleague Endeavor that pegs subsidies for EVs alone at, I think, 3% of central government fiscal revenue. If that's EVs alone, that does not necessarily bode well for being able to hit all the technological targets, and it's going to take a lot of money to do all of that. So that's key for me in the months and years ahead.
Abby.
Yeah, so I'd say there's three issues that I'd love to probe more. The first I already discussed briefly, which is this idea of kind of human capital retention. As Yingyi mentioned, like researchers are endlessly mobile. And while there is a sense of optimism about the Chinese research system right now, there are other increased pressures, and I'd be curious at probing more, how researchers are navigating evolutions both in the Chinese system and kind of the broader global system. Secondly, I am endlessly fascinated by state tech firm relationships in China and by kind of what firms' increasing involvement in the mechanics of governance mean for how the state governs, how priorities get set, particularly when it comes to industrial policy and issues of innovation, what it means for state accountability, legitimacy, et cetera. And I think that there's a ton to probe there still that I was unable to cover in this relatively brief trip. Just to give kind of a related anecdote, this was the first time that I've heard Chinese interlocutors and friends start to be a little bit concerned about the amount of data that various tech firms are collecting about them, including a couple of friends who mentioned that they had started to pay for things in cash again because they didn't like the amount of data essentially that was being gathered about them in every facet of their lives. And so I think that as you see this increasingly porous relationship between firms and local level governance issues is an interesting thread to pull on. And then I would just say that, while there's there's a lot that I don't personally agree with about China's data governance policies, particularly when it comes to biological data, they are more coherent than the American approach, and there has been more of a willingness to course correct when they seem to have overshot to some degree when it comes to securitization. And so I'd actually be really interested in talking to officials more about how they're thinking about data as a productive resource, where they see lingering issues in the current governance structure, et cetera.
Very interesting. Yingyi, you just got back, but maybe you have things you didn't get to investigate this time.
Sure. I also noticed, if I can, the first question in Q&A is about the Chinese college students' employability issue. So yes, so I would certainly like to probe on the issue of education and employment nexus. And
since you're going to speak to that, let me just to be everyone knows what the question is. The question is that essentially is that many college graduates are having difficulty of finding employment. And is that true? And if it's true, how does that relate back to thinking about the role of higher education in Chinese society?
Well, my short answer is it's absolutely true. The youth unemployment, especially the college graduates, job hunting is extremely challenging. A lot of people do not even want to go to the job market, so they keep going to graduate school, more education, and to delay this question of looking for a job. So, so I really like to know if American immigration policy reform happens. Let's just say President Trump initially proposed to give a green card to STEM PhD, for example. If that's ever going to happen, what would Chinese students change their minds or increase their interest in coming to America? So that's the question that I want to know. And that's also one of the policy recommendations that I am making, is to have H-1B visa have a dedicated one category specifically for students who have American degrees. Right now, we don't really have that special category. So my second area that I want to do further investigation is that's something that I still have not really mentioned, which is something I've learned from this trip, is the gender wars. And I think the gender wars especially happens in the area of college educated men and women. Okay. And so I'm actually curious. A lot of college-educated women in China are under huge pressure to get married and having children. So there is a misalignment between the progress of education area that women have made and employment area and family area. So I'm actually very curious to see whether there is this higher level of interest among women to study abroad, to actually it's a protection, or it's actually trying to get away from the gender discrimination in the labor market, facing women college graduates barriers in the job market. So that's the area that I do want to make the connection: the gender wars and study abroad.
Very, very, very interesting. I see a few more questions in the Q&A. I'm going to try to work them into the conversation here. And so one of them I'm going to again pose to all of you, and I'm going to just sort of slightly change it a little bit, to the extent that we're all back in the U.S. now, and until we have the opportunity maybe to go back and do our own on-the-ground research. I wonder if each of you can recommend a particular resource, whether it's a particular outlet or a particular journalist, a particular academic who is particularly useful for you for understanding the evolving story in China when you're away and reliant on someone else's on-the-ground reporting. So I don't want to put anyone on the spot. So round robin style, each of you can kind of just jump in when you have an idea of someone that you want to promote in this opportunity.
I can start.
Sure.
I recommend there's a YouTube channel by a former investigative journalist working at China's CCTV, but whose channel was banned and who are banned from even entry to PR China. And he has a YouTube channel, and he's like this is a news coverage on China, and that has become a very important source because he's a very probably one of the most renowned investigative journalists in China. His news analysis is very, I would say, nuanced and fact-oriented, and I just got a lot of insights from it. His
So
name is
Yingyi, for this
Wang
recommendation
Zhi'an.
to work, that's right. I was going to say for this recommendation to work, you have to say who he is. Otherwise, it'll be very hard.
Wang Zhi'an.
Wang Zhi'an. Maybe we could also put
he's-
that in the chat if people want to look them up.
He has 1.8 million subscribers now.
And for someone who might be unfamiliar with Chinese, how would you spell it?
Should I put in
You
the
could just say,
chat?
because some people will be watching this on YouTube and they won't see text. So Wang, W-A-N-G.
W-A-N-G is his surname. His first name is Z-H-I-A-N.
Great. And so that should be easy enough to find on YouTube. Great. Who else? Who's else? I think Abby sort of raised her hand.
Yeah. As someone interested in the tech space, I'm going to give a shout out to one of the other members of the Penn Project, Kyle Chan. His Substack on industrial policy is great. I will also say if you were looking for a really quick, interesting read that is totally non-academic, but very enlightening in terms of a lot of the innovation going on in China and kind of complexities of the state industry relationship within that, I really would recommend Xiaowei Wang's Blockchain Chicken Farm. It also is addressing issues in rural China, which I think is a very important part of the story in China that often gets kind of ignored by the media. And so I would recommend it for that reason as well.
Great. Others? Maggie, Josh, Matt, do you have anyone you want to promote or recommend?
I would just say, so there's a podcast, Environment China, that's run by the Beijing Energy Network, which is still alive and well, and it includes a lot of civil society, people who are members of civil society working in energy policy in China, and brings a lot of different perspectives. And I'm thinking like World Resources Institute, those who still have presence there, but also a lot of the Chinese civil society organizations and energy think tanks. But helps kind of keep an ear to the ground in terms of what's happening along the lines of what Josh was talking to and meeting the dual carbon goals, among other things.
In that vein, there's I think Finnish scholar researcher Lori Milavirta who often writes on China's clean energy trajectory and carbon emissions. He's for Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air. And then I providentially, as issues pop up, so Tom Friedman had a visit earlier this year and then was on Ezra Klein's podcast to talk about his visit. And then Kyle had a piece in the New York Times and was on a number of podcasts, including China Talk or on Sinica, and there were several others. One on Decouple that he was on, and another called Unheard. And so sometimes I think there are opportunities for us around pieces that emerge that get a lot of traction. So whether it's Tom Friedman's piece or Kyle's podcast pop up providentially around those key arguments.
Kyle getting a lot of support from his fellows in this program. Matt.
If we're looking for China-based, or should I say recently returning China-based, Sichen Wang, recently back in Beijing, I think is a great source. And then certainly for...
And we should just say, so Wang Zichen, the longtime impresario of the Pekingnology Substack.
I think very useful on economic issues. If you're looking for US-based folks, I find George DePippo and Brad Setzer, especially from a macro perspective and on trade, are very, very good. And sometimes a little bit, I wouldn't say controversial, but willing to question conventional wisdom and dive deep into the data. So can always appreciate reading some of their stuff.
Gerard, now at the Rand China Center, also a contributor to our project, and Brad Stetzer. I think he's still probably at the Council on Foreign Relations, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that's right.
We are getting close to the end here. There is a question, a very interesting question about whether any of you have observations to make on cultural policy. I'm not sure that this group would. I will give you an opportunity to answer it if you can, but I do want to take the occasion to mention that we would love to have a fellow who is writing on cultural policy in this project. And so when we announced the call for applications for the 4th cohort of Penn Project Fellows in January of 2026, I very much hope that anyone who's interested in cultural policy will either apply or will put forward recommendations to people to apply for that. But it's possible that one of you have a view about this. So let me see if that is in fact the case. So that reinforces that we need to find a new fellow for this theme of cultural policy, and I very much hope to see that type of application in the year or years ahead. Well, we've just about reached the end of time, and so I want to be respectful of everyone's time, both those of you who are on our audience, but also this great group of panelists. Thank you all for sharing your insights and your takeaways. I learned a lot from all of you on the trip. I learned a lot from you in this discussion, and I know I will continue learning a lot from you in the months ahead as each of you finish your policy papers and we start to share those in further webinars. For the audience, I do want to underscore that this webinar series will start to gain some traction in the months ahead. We will, of course, do webinars with this 3rd cohort of fellows when they publish their draft papers later in the fall. But as our project expands in scope and as we have different types of initiatives that you can read about on our website, including European initiative, including a new Asia-Pacific initiative, I think we should use this channel to try to produce useful conversations in the public discourse. And I also want to put a plug in for our podcast, the China Studies podcast, which is about to become a very regular show with a new episode dropping in a few days. So for those of you who are interested in whether it's video or audio content. We should have a lot of that coming your way soon, alongside the final publication of the papers from our second cohort of fellows and the draft papers from this cohort of fellows, and lots more to come. So stay tuned, and thank you again for joining us tonight. Good night, everybody.